Vladimir Putin. He's been making lots of headlines in 2024 because of launching his special military operation into Ukraine and doing a lot of other stuff. But this begs the question, what if Vladimir Putin was never president of Russia? With that, let's get some context of the 90s and why the conditions were set for his presidency. Russia in the 1990s was a pretty terrible place to be. Although communism was gone, life sucked because Yeltsin was an idiot and had absolutely awful advisors from the Clinton administration for how to run his country. The mafia and oligarchs also had more power than most government officials, and democracy in Russia was a complete sham, especially after the 1993 constitutional crisis and after the 1996 election. Furthermore, Yeltsin launched the intensely unpopular First Chechen War in 1994 that went pretty bad for him. The 1996 Russian presidential election had seen Yeltsin as extremely unpopular and entered into a lot of schemes, corrupt bargains, and election fraud to create a bunch of other parties to help split the vote in the first round of the Russian parliamentary election to get himself renominated. He also received a lot of outside support, notably from Clinton, who liked the drunk. Anyway, Yeltsin won the 1996 election and the country continued to plunge into crap. Boris Yeltsin resigned in 1999, and this brought Vladimir Putin to power as he was Yeltsin's prime minister and seen as a Yeltsin loyalist during his tenure. But in the 2000 presidential campaign, Putin had a very vague platform on most issues, but he presented himself as a strongman to fix a lot of issues that had plagued Russia in the 90s, such as the mafia, corruption, oligarchs, and terrorism during the Second Chechen War, and he would win the election. This brings me to Alexander Lebed, who was a former Russian general who commanded Soviet airborne troops in the Soviet-Afghan War and in the Transnistrian War. After catching the public attention with his actions in Moldova in 1992, the general came to be perceived as being an honest anti-establishment patriot who stood against government corruption and wanted to restore order. Although he had mixed feelings about democracy in Russia because, well, Yeltsin had messed everything up in the 90s and things were crappy in Russia. But despite his mixed feelings, he was viewed as a pro-democracy candidate who was also seen as a Napoleonic figure. Lebed's 1996 campaign initially had a poor showing, with a small grassroots presence comprising of mostly former paratroopers. However, Lebed's campaign witnessed a massive boost in publicity and therefore support as a result of Yeltsin supporting his campaign in order to siphon away votes from other candidates. But Lebed would actually even achieve strong third-place showing before being forced to drop out of the race for not being in the second place after the next round of voting. Lebed's policies included a pledge to end the extremely unpopular war in Chechnya, and during his presidential campaign he was strongly critical of Yeltsin's decision to even send troops into Chechnya in the first place. He was also skeptical of NATO's expansion's ramifications on Russia when combined with the fact that Clinton's economic advisors had pretty much put all of Russia's resources for sale to foreign countries. And Lebed also feared that since everyone was wiping their feet on Russia, then Russia would eventually have to show her teeth. During the Yeltsin administration, Lebed was made Secretary of the Security Council in June of 1996 to boost Yeltsin's perception, and of course, yo boy Lebed had to shake things up in office. The guy ended the First Chechen War and made a lot of political enemies in the Yeltsin administration due to just how popular he was, and he was of course fired in October for being just too cool. In 1997, Lebed took a trip to the United States where he met with many American businesses as due to the 1996 election, how it went down, he knew that Clinton's scheming got Yeltsin re-elected. Coincidentally, he met with future President Donald Trump at Trump Tower. Reportedly, he discussed potential construction projects in Moscow that Trump could be involved in, and Trump then came back to Russia with him and said that it was absolutely terrific. Lebed's overall time in America left him with a pretty positive rub-off with many American politicians and businesses, and as well as his own view on the country. There was speculation that he would run for the presidency in 2000 as he was considered one of the most popular candidates against Moscow Mayor Yuri Luzhkov, who was projected to be his main opponent at the time. However, in 2000, Lebed decided against running for president because he was satisfied with his position as the governor of Krasnoyarsk Krai, where he had won the 1998 election as an outsider against an incumbent, and it was also Russia's second largest region. Regardless, General Lebed met his end in 2002 during a suspicious helicopter crash that has been alleged to have possibly been sabotage. Changes to occur in an alternate timeline to create a Lebed presidency in Russia and prevent Vladimir Putin from ever becoming president would first be if Yeltsin didn't resign on New Year's Eve 1999. You see, if Yeltsin had not resigned, Putin had never been nominated. He would have been a Yeltsin loyalist and therefore seen as part of the Yeltsin administration and, of course, part of the problem, so Putin would then no longer rise to prominence. Because Putin has not been handed the presidency, there is no real law and order candidate who will be fighting corruption. Therefore, Alexander Lebed decides to run in 2000, and due to his strong support, I feel like he would win despite any dirty tricks that Putin or any other candidates may have up their sleeves. So now that Lebed has successfully defeated Putin or another candidate, what's his term going to be like? First, Lebed would run a hard anti-corruption administration to counter the destruction of another year that Yeltsin's administration had. He would likely use force to bust several oligarchs and to combat the mafia's control over certain cities and regions which had been overrun by organized crime. Other aspects of his administration in Russia would be chasing away some companies that he saw as taking advantage of Russia. And of course, he would be allowing Trump's construction projects to take place. Also, something that Lebed really wanted to do was to turn Siberia into a massive international airline hub, which may or may not happen in this alternate timeline, as Lebed was a very big dreamer on projects, but it's no telling how much this would actually cost and if it would even happen in the first place. Regarding NATO and its enlargement, General Lebed had been strongly against the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe initially, but by 1997 he had changed his attitude to be more accepting of the idea. However, in March of that year he stated that he believed NATO expansion would destabilize the alliance as a result of Cold War thinking that had built the alliance between Russia and NATO, and he also foresaw that it would cause Russia to become an authoritarian state in response. So in this alternate timeline where Lebed is president of Russia, he has good relations with the United States after Clinton leaves office, and regarding NATO, he presents his concerns while accepting the alliance's expansion. I feel like since Lebed had not let Russia down a reactionary pathway the same way Putin had, then NATO is more likely to be not as hostile towards Russia, provided Russia doesn't provoke anyone, but that of course may just be wishful thinking. On the other hand, Lebed actually got along pretty well with the West in 1997 and changed his positions on NATO to be more moderate. But, of course, Lebed was also aggressive towards some of Russia's neighbors such as Moldova because of the situation in Transnistria. So it's difficult to say how Russo-NATO relations would be in an alternate Lebed presidency compared to how things went down under Putin's 2 terms. It all depends also on how Lebed and NATO hash things out at the start of his presidency. The Second Chechen War would still have broken out under Yeltsin, but Russia would have had to endure Yeltsin's invasion of the region instead of Putin's, and it's difficult to determine how much Yeltsin's team would have learned from their first invasion. Assuming the invasion went the same as it did in our timeline under Putin, and Yeltsin was sober for 1 mere minute, Lebed would come in during the insurgency phase, but the damage had already been done to the Russian military as many Russian generals were killed in the invasion. Lebed would have probably begun restructuring and modernizing Russia's military, unlike Putin and Yeltsin. Lebed was a hardliner when it came to state funding being allocated to the military, and he would have heavily cracked down on oligarchs using that money for another summer mansion. Additionally, since this is the early 2000s and after the start of the global war on terrorism, Lebed might work with NATO in Chechnya as Russia was fighting against radical terrorists. The 2000s in this alternate timeline would see Russia working more closely with the United States in Afghanistan, as Alexander Lebed himself had fought in the country during the Soviet-Afghan War. And as the US and Russia have a better relationship, Russia will be more involved in US planning for operations in the country. Depending how much things are changed in Afghanistan, it might impact the 5th NATO enlargement of 2004, but I don't really see that happening, but it's something worth mentioning. I do feel like NATO would expand as it did in our timeline in 2004, and it's possibly okay with Russia if the Russians escalated actions in Transnistria, but Russia's response under Lebed could be moderate, as Lebed would see it as a trade deal where the Russians advance more in Moldova and therefore NATO expands. But Russia doesn't enter a revisionist period, so NATO and Russia are not hostile, just geopolitical competitors throughout the rest of the 2000s. The future will really depend on who comes to power in the alternate 2008 Russian presidential election. Will it be a Lebed realist, a Russian anti-NATO revisionist, or another ideology completely? That will be up to you, as I cannot accurately predict that. This is of course just one possible scenario for if Putin never became the president of Russia, but what do you think would have happened? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.